Well, it's a good question because, as you know, in many cases, for example, in some of our African countries and so on, there was a more violent process to the acquisition of independence and a much sharper rupture with the colonial period. Whereas in India, we had a non-violent movement for independence followed by a peaceful transfer of power, after which in many ways the colonial state continued with minor modifications over time. So many of the trappings, whether it's the steel frame of the Raj, the civil service, whether it's the bureaucratic system, the judicial system, the courts, the administration, the bureaucracy, all of this represents a sort of steady continuity, and there's certainly no sense of recrimination or bitterness about what was there before. My argument was somewhat different. I was invited in what I thought was a routine thing, like the many, many other speeches that I deliver in many places, to participate in a debate on whether Britain owes reparations to her former colonies. And while I'm not a big fan of the idea of financial reparations, I thought it gave me an opportunity to lay out the case for why there is at least a moral debt to be paid. It went on the YouTube and it went viral to an extent that within the first 24 hours, some 3 million people downloaded it. And at that point, the publishers called and said, you have to write a book. And I said, don't be silly, everyone knows this already. And he replied, no, they don't know it already, because if they did, your speech wouldn't have gone viral. You've opened the eyes of large numbers of Indians, and they need to see it in a more lasting form. That's why I wrote the book. And thereafter, the continued legs, as it were, for this issue in 2017 is a combination of two factors. One is merely publishing schedules. The book came out in India in November 16 and in Britain in March 17, in Australia only in September this month in 2017. So each new edition generates its own wave of interest, reviews, critiques, television appearances, arguments, and so on. And that's why the issue, from my point of view as a writer, has continued to remain relevant. But what is also striking, and that's the second point, is that after all, many books are published, many authors are promoting their books, and they don't get this kind of attention. So I would argue that the reason these issues are getting attention still is because people are really interested in them and concerned about them. That as these issues come up, particularly in the context of the 70th anniversary of our independence, where people are looking back at the British legacy, at partition, at the continued influence of the British Raj on our daily life, on our laws, on our penal code, all of these things, on our parliamentary system. As all of this continues, people are beginning to ask more questions, and I think better late than never. We are, in my view, very much a forgive and forget culture. So I'm saying, let us forgive by all means. I am not at all one for keeping grudges or nourishing and nurturing hatreds. But let us not forget. Forgetting is the real sin, because as I often say to young people in India, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? Yeah, I mean, I have to say that that I mentioned in the preface to the book that very often you hear people making a speech about a book. It is the first time the book is a result of the speech. So that's why I feel particularly gratified that this book has turned out to be literally my most successful book in hardback ever. It sold over 50,000 copies in hardback, which in India is quite astonishing, because normally 5,000 is all it takes to get you on the bestseller list. I would argue that if there hadn't been any British, the logical thing we would have seen would have been a continual expansion of Maratha power. The Marathas at one point actually controlled most of the northern part of India as well as the Deccan Peninsula. The Mughal emperor was essentially a hostage of the Marathas. They kept him on his throne. They nominally and formally paid obeisance to him as the emperor of India. But in practice, his authority ceased when they told him it ceased, and he was only able to do what they allowed him to do. Now that could have been incipient constitutionalism. You could have imagined in this situation the Maharaja, or the Mughal emperor rather, the Badshah, becoming more and more like the British Queen, with the real power being exercised by a temporal authority, in which, in this case, established by the force of Maratha arms. And with the passage of time, with increasing authority in the part of the various provinces and so on, I could easily imagine an India, a united, undivided India, including today's Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. Such a country with a nominal constitutional monarch as a figurehead and a strong domestic political arrangement. I think that democracy, for example, when it swept around the world, would have reached us also. If the Marathas were ruling through tough Peshwas and the gun and the sword, they too might have faced demands for popular suffrage and vote. Who knows? Counterfactual history is essentially speculative, and anything that I guess is only as good as anything you guess. But I'm making my guess on the basis of the existing trends that were interrupted by the British conquest. No, I think that the arguments and the critiques have already been answered in the book. Everything that has been said about what the British left behind has been said by people who haven't read the book carefully, because I have myself taken every single example and refuted it. Now, it's also true that there are some questions of emphasis on which people could disagree. So some have said that I have not given enough credit to the good things, which I have mentioned. I mentioned that there were good administrators who were not racist. There were people. I mentioned Sir Arthur Cotton's role in irrigating the Godavari Plains as one example, or Jim Corbett in setting up the natural parks. So there are examples like that. I'm not saying that every single Englishman was evil or that everything they did was unbelievably bad. I don't say that in the book. So the only criticism that can be made is that there were positives that are not given equal amount of space. But my book is not about a balanced treatment. My book is about making an argument. So somebody else is willing to write a book focusing only on the good things. To my mind, those good things were there, but they were done by people who were in India in service of a bad cause, the cause of oppressing a people in the interests of a country far away. So one day somebody can write a book saying what the British did for India instead of what the British did to India, and I'm sure they will find readers also. That I have no problem with. But my own arguments remain very much what they are. The only point that I could perhaps have devoted a few more lines to than I did, and which is important to acknowledge, and that arguably I have not done enough to acknowledge, is that the British rule had a very positive catalyzing effect on helping liberate the Dalit community. Now, many Dalits have said to me that, after all, you mention Ambedkar and Phule, but without the British, would they have been able to come into their own? And I would agree that I should underscore that point, that foreign rule did give them a chance to break free of conventional caste prejudice. But I also point out that in a place in India where there was no foreign rule, namely in Travancore, you had a Dalit leader like Mahatma Ayyankali, who was also able to lead a reform movement that persuaded the Maharaja to remove some of the proscriptions and prohibitions against the so-called untouchable community. So you didn't need to have the British. Ayyankali actually never went to any school, not only not to a British school. He was an illiterate man, but he was able to stand up for the values and morals on the basis of his own strength of character. And I think there is no reason to believe that the Dalit community would not have been able to produce heroes. If the British had not been there, there would have been heroes rebelling against Indian social structure. Social reform is inevitable in every society.